With chapter 6, we come at last to the beginning of the story of the great flood that wiped out almost all life on earth about 4,400 years ago. The story occupies chapters 6 through 9 of the sacred scriptures, with chapter 6 beginning with an introduction and chapter 9 concluding with a coda. One of the reasons for the relatively great length of this story is that it's actually a clumsy amalgamation of at least two flood legends that had circulated in Mesopotamia for thousands of years, and were learned and copied down by Judaic scribes when they were captives in Babylon, beginning about 597 BCE and lasting for some 70 years. It was during that time that much of the Torah took shape, with the stories in Genesis 1 through 11 mostly compiled during that time and repurposed by a community that already had the stories of the Exodus, the occupation of the Promised Land, and the monarchy of King David. I think at this point I need to lay out my vision for this series of Sunday school lessons. I don't intend to spend this entire series with these foundational stories from Genesis. There are much more interesting and timely subjects to address. Once I'm done with the first 11 chapters of Genesis, my plan is to move on to some of those other matters, but I want at least to cover that part of the Bible that's pertinent to my upbringing as a young earth creationist. These being the relevant stories, as a visit to Answers in Genesis will attest. So, in the spirit of that aim, when people began to multiply on the face of the ground, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that they were fair, and they took wives for themselves of all that they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in mortals forever, for they are flesh. Their days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went in to the daughters of humans who bore children to them. These were the heroes that were of old, warriors of renown. The Lord saw that the wickedness of humankind was great in the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he had made humankind on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out from the earth the human beings I have created, people together with animals and creeping things and birds of the air, for I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the sight of the Lord. These are the descendants of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. And Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. And God saw that the earth was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted its ways upon the earth. And God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. Now I am going to destroy them along with the earth. Make yourself an ark of cypress wood. Make rooms in the ark, and cover it inside and out with pitch. This is how you are to make it. The length of the ark, 300 cubits. Its width, 50 cubits. And its height, 30 cubits. Make a roof for the ark, and finish it to a cubit above, and put the door of the ark in its side. Make it with lower, second, and third decks. For my part, I am going to bring a flood of waters on the earth to destroy from under heaven all flesh in which is the breath of life. Everything that is on the earth shall die. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall come into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you. And of every living thing, of all flesh, you shall bring 2 of every kind into the ark, to keep them alive with you. they shall be male and female. Of the birds according to their kinds, and of the animals according to their kinds, of every creeping thing of the ground according to its kind, 2 of every kind shall come into you, to keep them alive. Also take with you every kind of food that is eaten, and store it up, and it shall serve as food for you and for them. Noah did this. He did all that God commanded him. In this chapter, the first 8 verses really lay the groundwork for the flood, which was a divine response to human wickedness. It is a hideous story that would be unthinkable even if it were physically possible, which it most certainly is not. Yet, along with millions of other brainwashed people, the family of my birth continues to believe it without question and judge God's response to have been altogether righteous and appropriate. Such is the monster they worship. Such is their ideal of goodness to which they aspire. If you burn in hell with full awareness for all eternity, you damn well had it coming. God didn't send you there, you sent yourself. And so forth. I swear that all the malice my family ascribes to Satan, the Bible attributes to God. I've searched the Bible high and low for any clue that Satan at his worst holds a candle to Yahweh, and have found none. Let's have a look at a few of the things that really pissed off the creator of the strong and weak nuclear forces. First, about half of the descendants of Adam were, of course, female and were fair to look upon, according to the lecherous authors of these morally challenged tales. It turns out that the male descendants of that same original human weren't the only ones who found them so. So did the sons of God, whoever they were. Since verses 2 and 4 of this chapter are the only mention in the New Revised Standard Version from which I just read of sons of God, we have to see what other translations say. The King James Version, up with which I grew, uses it in the plural form quite a few times, almost always pertaining to true believers, and in the singular even more, most often applicable to Jesus, but also to Adam, and once, in the book of Daniel, to a coming Messiah. There are other uses, however, the most interesting being in the book of Job. There are 3 instances of it there, the first 2 of which are found in the first 2 chapters. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them. And again there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them to present himself before the Lord. These verses are, of course, the setup for the absolutely stomach-churning story of the mistreatment of righteous Job on account of God's accepting a bet with the devil. A story topped for its sheer immorality only by the genocide of Genesis 6 through 9 and the horror of eternal torment for non-believers like yours truly on account of thought crimes. So who are these sons of God in Job? There's another clue in chapter 38 of that book, when the story is wrapped up with God's insufferably arrogant haranguing of Job for his ignorance. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, "Who is this that darkeneth counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up now thy loins like a man, for I will demand of thee, and answer thou me. Where wast thou when I laid the foundations of the earth? Declare, if thou hast understanding. Who hath laid the measures thereof, if thou knowest? Or who hath stretched the line upon it? Whereupon are the foundations thereof fastened? Or who laid the cornerstone thereof, when the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy?" In the New Revised Standard Version, instead of sons of God, in those verses you'll find heavenly beings. The reference here appears to be to angels, who are also characterized as morning stars. There are also New Testament references to the day star and the bright and morning star and so forth that appear to apply to Jesus as risen Christ. Confusion compounds confusion. Wish I'd thought to silence my phone. Of course, the appearance of Satan among the sons of God in Job lent support to the Christian idea that Satan was a fallen archangel, and you wouldn't believe what my particular creationist cult made of that. That notion of a powerful and evil angel kicked out of heaven, taking a third of the other angels with him and wreaking havoc on the earth, was actually used as the linchpin of an argument that placed millions of years between the first two verses of Genesis, the so-called gap theory, which attempted to reconcile the apparent great age of the earth with a biblical chronology that suggests mere thousands of years. This nonsense could be found in notes published in the Scofield Reference Bible, which was considered authoritative by the luminaries of my childhood church who held my young mind down and made love to it. I could go on listing the books that have been published by the never idle presses of apologetics ministries, but there wouldn't be much point in doing it because these are all so obviously fanciful, mythological tales with no direct correspondence to the actual physical world. If you examine the 38th chapter of Job, from which I quoted a few verses, you'll see a snow globe earth represented there, standing on pillars with a hard firmament arching overhead, with the sun, moon, and stars moving across that firmament on a regular 24-hour basis. The whole shebang surrounded by water. A comparison of that passage with the early verses of Genesis 1 is instructive. This is flat earth cosmology, sure as shooting, and cannot be reconciled with the Copernican view, much less anything more recent. How can anyone take this literally? How's that even possible? Words fail me. Anyway, these sons of God made some of those fair daughters of men their wives and had children by them. Although the references in the second and fourth verses of Genesis 6 are interrupted by an awkward interpolation of the sort we've seen in earlier chapters, this illicit breeding appears to be responsible for the presence of the Nephilim. Let's have a closer look. When people began to multiply on the face of the ground, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that they were fair, and they took wives for themselves of all that they chose. Here's the interpolation. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in mortals forever, for they are flesh. Their days shall be 120 years. Close interpolation. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went in to the daughters of humans, who bore children to them. These were the heroes that were of old, warriors of renown. The Bible really needed better editors. Even I, with my predilection to prolixity, could have done better than that. I'll just transpose the position of verse 3, and you'll see exactly what I mean. When people began to multiply on the face of the ground, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that they were fair, and they took wives for themselves of all that they chose. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went in to the daughters of humans, who bore children to them. These were the heroes that were of old, warriors of renown. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in mortals forever, for they are flesh. Their days shall be 120 years. And then go on with the story from there. If this were handed in to me as an assignment, I'd mark it in red and chastise the author for structural inelegance and sloppiness. Now, what in living hell are Nephilim? Well, verse 4 suggests that they were present on earth both before and after the flood, and that must mean that unless Noah took a breeding pair of them on the ark along with all those other animals, the production of them must be an ongoing process, as from time to time an angel has his way with a maid. I'll bet all those stories of alien abduction are relevant here. Shouldn't we be drawing some connections for the sake of long-term human survival? Why are the aliens always giving humans anal probes? I want to know these things. These are questions that would have been forbidden in the Sunday school of my young years, so I'm going to raise them here. As I indicated in an earlier lesson, there are no thought crimes. The King James Version has some interesting light to throw on the question, who are the Nephilim? Here are verses 2 through 4 in that venerable translation, and notice also the language of the interpolated passage. And it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. And the Lord said, My spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh. Yet his days shall be 120 years. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them. The same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown. And also after that. Clearly the Nephilim are among us to this day. Some of them might be your neighbors. They might explain Donald Trump and Mitch McConnell and Matt Gaetz for sure. There are, of course, stories that have circulated for decades, if not centuries, of fossils of human giants in various parts of the world, including China, Turkey, and North America. Just do a Google search for fossil giants and you'll find plenty to keep you entertained. Those alleged discoveries have, of course, been accompanied by reference to Genesis 6:4 and a number of other verses in that translation scattered throughout the so-called historical books of the Bible. I think we ought to take a look at that interpolation I identified earlier. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in mortals forever, for they are flesh. Their days shall be 120 years. You might recall that in the King James Version, the Lord said, My spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. That seems to suggest something completely different. If we take the New Revised Standard Version reading, it clearly points back to that notion that first surfaced in chapter 2 of the breath of life, a notion we are soon to meet again in this chapter. The King James Version, on the other hand, seems to suggest a conflict, a battle between God and stubborn-minded humans with their minds set on wickedness. But whichever reading you prefer, this little trope is almost jarringly out of context. Seems to have nothing to do whatsoever with the account into which it's been shoehorned. I'll offer my dilettantish thoughts on the matter, since after all, that's all I heard from others when I was a kid anyway, and at least I bothered to look shit up. If you look at the ages of the patriarchs from the death of Noah at 950 to that of Moses at 120, you'll find, with a couple of exceptions, a steady decline in longevity. Shem was 600, for instance, when he bought the farm, while his 9th generation grandson Abraham died at 175. since so much of the Torah is occupied with the figure of Moses, to the extent that the Pentateuch even attributes its first 5 books to his authorship, I think I see a possibility. This little interpolation could be an etiology of sorts. It accounts for the eventual age of death of the author of the tales attributed to him. At least I can't come up with anything better than that. If something more plausible occurs to you, please let me know. We come finally to the thing that's really got the conjurer of everything in a tizzy. The Lord saw that the wickedness of humankind was great in the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he had made humankind on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out from the earth the human beings I have created, people together with animals and creeping things and birds of the air, for I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the sight of the Lord. This almost requires no comment at all. But of course I'm going to make one. If we saw a child behaving that way, just mad as hell at how shitty the gift he was trying to make for his mom at Bible school turned out with, glue and glitter all over the room, and just started swearing at it and throwing things and trying to set his doomed project on fire, wouldn't we try to calm the kid down and get him back to a level of functioning appropriate to whatever age the kid happened to be? This is a cosmic temper tantrum, and just comical if you stand back from it a little. But that's the thing, and the whole point of these Sunday school lessons, really. When I was a kid, being indoctrinated in these fables that were declared to be the Word of God, I couldn't stand back from it. And neither can my family. And neither can scores of millions of deluded voters in the United States and their poor, poor children who are being homeschooled with a science curriculum that includes educational material from Answers in Genesis. Ken Ham has made a fortune on that Ark park of his. That makes me sick. All of that makes me sick. And whether those who imagine themselves to be whole and therefore in no need of a physician ever realize it or not, that makes all of us sick. This has got to end somehow. This is not fair to those kids. The system is failing them, and that's a recipe for disaster. Our civilization is falling apart because the authority and prestige of science and the value of education are being undercut from every direction. Those first 8 verses are basically the backstory for the catastrophe that's about to happen. They're followed by what structurally behaves as a postscript, or perhaps it might just be another interpolation. These are the descendants of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God, and Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Curiously enough, the same thing that was said of Noah, that he walked with God, is exactly what had been said of his great-grandfather Enoch, who was sucked up into heaven and began to enjoy eternal bliss, rather than being compelled to spend 100 years of his life building a goddamn boat and gathering breeding pairs of all the animals in the world and food for them, to say nothing of the horrors of the year-long husbandry of those animals once they were all boxed up inside that floating methane trap. Just doesn't seem fair somehow. Walking with God might pay off and it might not. Kind of the same as, not walking with God. From that point in chapter 6, the preparations for the flood begin in earnest, with specifications for the ark and everything, and that's what I'll take up next week. It's going to take me several weeks to get through this account because it essentially occupies the next 3 chapters and is obviously a poorly lithified conglomerate, not a coherent narrative. There are many wonders hidden among those tortured phrases, and many questions will no doubt arise in the minds of thoughtful readers and listeners. Join me if you are so inclined. I would enjoy your company.